Good afternoon. My name is Daisy Vasquez, and my midterm presentation will be about adoption studies. So today, I'm going to just talk about the overview of this presentation, and today I'll be talking about what is adoption studies, what has taken place, what they do, and what they look for in adoption studies, the history of adoption studies, when it dates back to, and the different things they looked for, the factors of adoption studies, the different things that they consider, and the different, again, factors that they include for these adoption studies. Famous adoption studies, so studies that are well known and well received for these cases, and Three Identical Strangers, which is a documentary about three triplets who were in adoptive studies that found themselves as they got older. So my introduction is going to be talking about what adoption studies is exactly. Basically, adoption studies is taking a child or twins or triplets and taking them away from their biological families, and putting them into a different adoptive family. And it's basically studying genetics versus environmental factors, nature versus nurture. The nature within us, which is our DNA, if it affects us more than our nurture, which is our environmental factors, which is like the things and the way that we were raised and we were raised around and in what environment. It studies the traits, the adoptees' traits from their biological family and from their adoptive family. If the genetics overtake them as a person as they grow up and as they become an adult and make their own choices and have their own personalities, or if the place that they're raised in and who they're raised around, those traits are overtaken and make them who they are, the personality and how they were raised, and like all their decision making. It's a lot of nature versus nurture, and it's a lot about how if we are predisposed to be whatever our families, our biological families, our ancestors' DNA is, or if we can change depending on our environmental factors and who and what we were raised around. So usually in these studies, they usually like to use newborn children because they want the results for the research to be as pure as possible. They want these newborn children to believe that their adoptive families are the families that, they were born into, their biological families. And if these children weren't, if these children didn't know that they were in adoptive families, then the research and the results would be consistent. If they were to learn at an early age that their adoptive family isn't their biological family, they would probably like interrupt the research, and it probably like, wouldn't make it as pure as it was if they didn't know. They usually don't tell the children about the adoptive study until they're in their like late 30s, early 40s, only because they want to see the traits of their biological families be observable and like be seen as they get older. The biological traits start to be seen as they get older and they mature and their comprehension is better, and when they have to make different and more responsible decisions, as like, when they become teenagers from 16 to 17 to 18, you're thinking about college and you have your own morality and your own moral compass, and you start to make your own decisions and have more responsibilities into your young adult years where you have jobs and start working, and into like your 30s where you're most likely have a children and family, and see if the biological factors of their real biological families affect them into their adult lives. And that's why they don't tell them until then, because they want to see the full extent of how their biological factors and their environmental factor affects them until they're fully formed adults. They usually like to use twins and triplets for these studies because they like to see more varieties in the variables and factors. They use twins a lot because they share the same DNA from their biological families, but they usually place them into different environmental factors and places. Like, for example, one twin could be in a blue-collar family while the other twin could be in a more affluent family, and see how those environments change them. And though they are twins and they are like share the same DNA, they're still individuals and they still have their own personalities, their own opinions, their own dislikes, and their own likes. They even use triplets sometimes to even have more like variety and more research done, but it obviously depends on the research like facility and the adoption agency. A lot of the families and a lot of the children that are taken to put into these adoptive studies are taken from broken homes. So basically like homes where they wouldn't be nurtured, they'd be neglected or abused, or parents that have a lot of I guess you could say, troubling traits or backgrounds, like a lot of depression, alcoholism, smoking habits, schizophrenia, BPD, or criminal behavior history, even anger issues, things like that. Because A, it takes the children and takes them out of a troubling and dangerous situation to put them in a better home. And B, those traits are most likely to be passed down and seen as like the adoptees get older. So those are reasons why they take them from those homes and from those people and put them in more like safe and a completely different environment to see if that helps them out more than their biological traits. So here's the history of adoptive studies. When I started looking into it, I didn't know that adoptive studies dated for a while back, around the 1920s, like late 1920s, early 1930s. There was this huge adoptive study in Sweden that took account their adoptive adoption registry and saw that used about 14,000 of like boys' files and adoptions. They used it for different things. They used it for, traits in irritable bowel syndrome and alcoholism and criminal like behavior. But back then there wasn't really like a focused like end. Like they didn't know what they wanted to look for. It was more just different things instead of focusing on one main point. And that was in Sweden. And yeah, around the 1930s, like mid 1930s, is when in the United States adoptive studies were being studied. So between 1930s and 1950s, these studies focused on intelligence. So there was a study I read about from Skodak and Skills where they took a child from a biological family. They had the biological family. They tested them to see if their IQ was average or below average. They placed the child into a family that had higher IQ to see if that would change their IQ or if that would to make them smarter, more intelligent, or more comprehensive. But then as like the studies went out, they started learning that genetics have a high influence on your IQ. So it wasn't that the study was inconclusive. It's just like it would have been a little biased since genetics do have a big role in IQ. So then around the 1960s, they focused more on the parents' biological traits and if it would just be passed down directly to the adoptee or the child's life or like their personality, even if they're in another like environment. And they usually look for parents with alcoholism or depression or any traits that are as noticeable as that, like I've said before, into the children. They don't account for a lot of medical genetics because medical like problems like cancer and all that stuff is completely different than mental traits and mental and psychological development things. So that was completely separated. And adoptive studies weren't really talked about until the 1980s when there was like a lot of famous cases that were happening. And coming around to be seen. And there's a lot of also ethical problems with it that I'll speak about later. So here's what they looked for throughout the years. To the 1930s and 1950s, they focused on IQ, like I said, on intelligence. But when they found out that genetics had a huge influence, they decided to move on more on the biological standpoints of the families and how it affected like a child. So basically like mental traits and inhabitable traits like alcoholism, depression, or smoking, or anything like that. Until the 1980s, the like early 1990s, they focused on more genetic versus environment. So basically, like in the 1960s, they focused more about like the parents and the biological standpoint and not as much as environmental factors. But it wasn't until like the 1980s and the 1990s that they really focused on genetic and environment factors. And if like just because you have a genetic trait, does that mean you're predisposed to have it, even if you're in a completely different and safer and better environment? Like, would that triumph over biological factors? Would that improve the risk of having those like negative traits in you if you're in a better family or home? But what the interesting is, it wasn't until like the 2000s that the criminal justice field thought that if they could see the traits biologically from these studies, why can't they see a child that could possibly have criminal behavior due to their genetics of like their families? So let's say a family had a lot of criminal activity, behavior, criminal offenses in their past, and it was brought down to a child. They're able to like observe those traits, recognize those traits, and maybe stop the child from becoming a future felon or a future criminal. which I think is really cool for them to be like, oh, if this child has antisocial traits or anger issues or anything like that, they could help the child not fall into the risk of what their parents did or like what their parents had done. So there's a lot of testing designs in these studies. So there's two ways these studies usually carry out: the adoptive study method, and the adoptee's family method. The adoptive study method is basically like the similarities between their biological family and their environmental family. And of course, there's going to be a lot of similarity between their biological family, but they want to see how similar they become to the people that they were raised around, that raised them, that were around constantly. Like they want to see like how similar those two can be. Even though biology is like in you, what's around you can affect you just as much. An adoptee's family method is basically like the adoptee's traits compared to like their non-biological siblings in the adopted family. Even though they have different complete genetics, they're still raised in the same family. So they want to see like how that differs and how that changes between them, and like what's different and what isn't. And if they're more similar than they would be with their biological siblings. So a lot of twins, like I said before, are preferred only because twins are, again, the same genetic DNA, and they're able to put these two kids and these two adoptees into different families and see the differences and see how different they are depending on whatever family they put in, and how their personality changes, how their traits changes, and how their biological factors come in as they get older. And with the two children, you can see the differences are more noticeable and they're more apparent than you would with a one child, because it's just one child and you would just see how one thing changed. But with the two children, you can see how some biological factors change with this one and with this one didn't, or how environmental factors change this one and the other one didn't. So that's why twins are preferred to see more differences between like each family and each study. So here's some famous adoptive study cases. So there was a really famous study done by an American psychologist known as Thomas J. Buschard. He was born in the 1930s. He studied genetic behavioral studies most of his life, and he did a lot of adoptive studies. But one of the most famous one that he had was with Jim Springer and Jim Lewis, Jim twins. They were twins that were separated and put into different homes, and they reunited at age 39 when they realized they had a lot of similarities in their lives. So basically, when they reunited, they got to talking, and a lot of newspapers did interviews on them, and they basically almost lived the same life. They married and divorced a woman named Linda to then remarry a woman named Betty. They, growing up, had the same dog named Toy. They were drinkers and smokers at the same amount, and they both suffered from migraines even at the same time. They both studied to be like electricians and plumbers and technical professions. And the most interesting one to me is that they both had firstborn sons that they named the same exact thing, James Allen and James Allen, except one of them in the Allen had 2 L's and the other Allen had 1 L. So it was a huge phenomenon how close their lives were. Even though they never met each other and they never knew about each other, their lives were extremely similar. And Thomas J. Buschard said that although, yes, like a lot of things, like a lot of theories say that twins are basically the same person, it's misleading, because even though they have the same DNA, they're completely different people, individuals, and they each have their own right. So, and one of my personal favorites adoptive study cases that I've learned before even studying this was 3 Identical Strangers. It's a nationwide famous case about triplet brothers who found themselves in college. And of course, they were part of an adoptive study, but they weren't told that. Even when they found each other, they were told that until they were like 30 or 40. Basically, how they met each other is that Robert went to college and basically was going around campus, like all that stuff. And everybody was saying, oh my God, like, hey, Edward, how are you, Edward? And it's like, I don't know who Edward is. Why is everyone calling me that? And then so somebody came up to him. He's like, oh, how are you? And he's like, my name isn't Edward. That's not who I am. And it's like, oh, well, there's someone who looks exactly like you. I think you should meet him. Edward and Robert met each other and they realized they were twins. They looked identical. And then, of course, because of that, newspapers and media and TV started coming about. And back then, there was no social media. So the news was the only way you can get entertainment and big information about, like, the world and all that stuff. So they did interviews how they found each other in college. And then the youngest one, David, found out because one of his friends called him over and was like, hey, there's 2 guys on TV that look just like you. He saw them. He called the station. And then he's like, I think I'm their 3rd brother. They reunited. And they quickly became an overnight sensation. Edward Gallen, David Kelman, and Robert Schaffman, though, in the adoptive studies, were raised in different socioeconomic homes. So basically, Robert Chafin Bobby was put into an affluent family. Edward Gallen was more put into a middle class family, and then David Kelman was put into the blue collar family. And as they got older and they got closer, things started changing. They started having a lot of fights, and just a lot of disputes. Even though they opened up a restaurant together, that's when they were told they were part of a study. And a lot of their memories came back where, as they got older, when they were children, a lot of doctors would come in, ask them questions, hook them up to systems. And that's when they started like realizing that they weren't separated out of coincidence. They're separated out of a study. And their mother gave them up because she was young and she had a lot of mental issues, and she didn't have the money to raise them. So they compensated her, and after that, she's been lost, but she had a big, long history of mental illness, of depression. And because of all of that, the youngest brother, David Kelman, sadly died to suicide. And that's when a lot of people started realizing that maybe these studies aren't ethical or aren't morally right. And then the documentary 3 Identical Strangers came out in 2018 about their lives. And that's when people started asking if like this is ethical at all, like taking people out of their homes and giving them identity crises when they're older, about not knowing who they were their entire lives, though they were put into better situations. A lot of psychologists, a lot of people say that adoptive studies should stop just off the basis of like the violation of personal consent and personal identity. And mind you, these studies are really hard to track themselves. They're just because of like the bio parents finding them again, the confidentiality of the adoption records and all of that. So sometimes adoptive studies are like seen as something ethically wrong by many people, but these studies are done because they need to see the traits and how things differ, and maybe possibly stopping any future criminals or felons. So the summary is, adoptive studies have been done for many, many years. Their conclusions help with the research of genetic possible criminal behavior. They help see how our genetics differ if we're put into different places, and maybe we're not predisposed to be what our genetics say that we're supposed to be. Our environment could affect us and could change us for the better. That's like a possible question that adoptive studies help. Each adoptive study differs depending on the child and the family and all that. But yeah, here are my references that I used to make this presentation. Here's where to contact me: my student email, my personal email, and my phone number. Thank you for listening to my adoption study, and have a great day.